Good evening, everyone. I am speaking to you as the chairperson of Kairos Ireland, and we welcome you to this evening's webinar, Remembering Nakba. This is the 75th anniversary of the terrible events that took place in Palestine when 60% of the Palestinian population was ethnically cleansed and driven out from their homes. We have people here tonight who are closely connected to that event, but also people who can help us to see how the process still continues. We will hear, first of all, from Jeffrey Corrie, who will outline the events of Plan D, the planned program to expel Palestinians from their homes in order to establish the state of Israel. Asad Abu Sharkh is a journalist and academic living in Dublin. His family were forced to flee Ashkelon in 1948 after it had been bombed by the Zionist Air Force. The people left carrying the keys to their homes. We will then have two contributions by ecumenical accompaniers who were human rights monitors this past winter. Finn was in the South Hebron Hills, and he will highlight the destruction of a school in Masafa Yatta by Israeli soldiers. Sophie Gregg was in Hebron City, and Sophie will focus on settler violence as the settlers try to take over more land from Palestinians. We're then going to go to Canada. Shadia is a Palestinian studying at Vancouver School of Theology. Shadia has just completed an MA, and she will compare the colonial structures used in the oppression of indigenous Americans, the so-called American Indians, and the same structures that were used in Palestine. We'll conclude with a prayer reflection from Tim Bowen-Evans, who was living in East Jerusalem in Sheikh Jarrah in 2010 or thereabouts. That's when he left. So it's going to be an interesting program. And first of all, I ask Jeffrey to give us an overview of the initial Nakba event in Palestine.
Hello, I'm going to show you a few slides to help to explain the circumstances that led up to May of 1948 and some of the particular events, the horrific events of that time. So in this picture, you can see refugees who have been evicted from their villages. And you'll notice that it's mainly women and children. There is one man to the left, but many men were taken prisoner of war between the ages of 10 and 50 and held in camps for a year or more after 1948. We have in Ireland have known Reverend Naim Atiq because he was the founder of Sabeel, a movement linked to the churches and which still continues today, but is also working with Kairos. And in his, he became an Anglican clergyman, but he remembers his way back as a child. He was 11 years of age on the 12th of May 1948, when the Zionist forces came into his town. They had some previous knowledge of something maybe happening about 2 weeks before, but a military commander just came in and told them that everyone had to go to the village. And so they had to just take whatever they could into their hands, and they couldn't, once they went to the village, they couldn't go back to their homes again, and not realizing that they could have taken more personal possessions. His father was the last to go, or the last to leave the house, and he had put some of his personal possessions outside the door for collection, and unfortunately he couldn't get back to get his gold and other things because his father was a goldsmith. But luckily, the busman, they were all put in a bus on the way to Nazareth. The bus passed his house, and he was able to plead to the bus driver to pop out and pick up some of his personal possessions, which then became terribly important for them as a family when they arrived in Palestine. I beg your pardon, when they arrived in Nazareth. And so it was quite a horrific experience, a shock that lasted for many years as they came to try to work with the reality, the new reality. And the churches in Nazareth was very helpful for many of them to find some kind of accommodation. A quote at the end says, "Instead of outrage at the injustice on the part of Christians, there was silence and submission. Instead of the prophetic outcry, there was painful resignation. It took many, many years before Palestinian Christians could reflect on what had happened to them and to articulate their own theology of liberation, which Naim was crucial in developing in the years afterwards." There were four big factors, let's call them geopolitical factors, that combined to make a set of circumstances in those 2 years, at 1947 to 48. The first was the Holocaust, when many Jewish refugees were immigrating to Israel from Europe, and clearly they needed housing when they arrived. So that was one big factor which underpinned the Nakba. Secondly, Britain suddenly decided, the British cabinet under a Labour government suddenly decided in February of 1947 to leave their British mandated Palestine. And it was something similar that they were having to leave India as well because of the post-war situation where they'd spent a lot of money on the Second World War. But that created a whole pile of political uncertainty. The third big factor was then Britain left it to the United Nations Assembly to work out what would happen next. And unfortunately, the Arab leadership, the Arab nations, did not sit on that special commission. UN was in very early days then. And so the Zionist participants were quite influential in seeking the partition of the country. And we'll see a map later on as to what the nature of that partition was. And the fourth big factor was that because of the British mandate they had crushed the Palestinian revolt of 1936-37, and a lot of the Arab leadership and Palestinians were they'd lost any sense of leadership and security for their own security forces to oppose the Nakba. So the big architect of Nakba was David Ben-Gurion, and he grew up in Poland, and he was age 60 by the time we get to 1946, when the Zionist Congress meeting met in Basel. He was made Minister of Defense. He had been earlier chairman of the Jewish Agency, and they gave him control over all security issues of the Jewish community in Palestine, and so he was a real strategic thinker, and he began to see the political vacuum rising out of those four factors that we've just mentioned, and he set about a plan. And he was also a realist. He realized that they couldn't take over all of Palestine, but as he described it, they were able to take over a large chunk of it. And he was instrumental in setting up an inner core group, which became known as the Consultant Committee. And they met in this building in Tel Aviv called the Red House. And they planned very systematically how they would, once the British were leaving Palestine, how they would take over local villages. It became known as Plan D or Plan Dalet, and they were able to use a lot of intelligence that had been compiled, called the Village Files, towards the end of the 30s and the early 40s, where they had mapped in a very systematic and strategic way each local village, and they knew the kind of people or where to go or who to be involved in the forced removal. There were three key military groupings that Ben-Gurion brought together. There was, first of all, what's called the Irgun troops, who were led at that stage by Menachem Begin, who was later a prime minister of Israel. And they had learnt a lot of aggressive tactics over the years. The second group were the Haganah, and they were quite a substantial grouping and had been trained in the British Army during the Mandate, and had been used against the Palestinian resistance. So they had a lot of skills and discipline themselves, and the use of bayonets and other military tactics. And the third group were a very special commando unit called the Palmach, and I think I've got that name right. And they had been used for very frontline tactics. So those three groups were part of the Plan D, and they were mobilized then once the UN resolution was adopted for the partition of Palestine. Palestine meaning the bigger area, which we'll see in a map in a minute. So there were one or two villages taken over towards the end of 1947, but it was February 1948 before the movement into villages. And it was mainly in the northern part of Palestine that there was early successes in Haifa, in Acre, and also in Safad. And then they moved further down south into Jerusalem and Jaffa, and then into other villages. There is one massacre particularly stays on in the memory of Palestinians, and it's called the Der Yassin massacre of the 9th of April. And there was when Palestine there was a lot of killings, and Palestinians fled from that area, and that sent the word of what happened sent shockwaves through the whole Palestinian community. So we can see that in that period of 7 months, and as the British began to withdraw, which was they set the date of May the 15th. That's why we are today the May the 15th, and Nakba is celebrated. That towards the end, as they moved towards Haifa to withdraw their troops, many of the military forces of the Jewish community took over local areas. And we have a statement there of that 531 Palestinian villages were destroyed and 11 urban neighborhood compounds. So here are the maps, and I don't expect you to suddenly understand it all within a few minutes, but over on the left-hand side is the map of Palestine, showing the boundaries of which the UN set out between the two, creating two separate states of Israel and Palestine. And you'll notice that down here, there was a land bridge between Gaza and what is now known as the West Bank. And up here, there was a sort of a land bridge between north of Jenin up into Nazareth and the northern area of Palestine. So when the Nakba and the enforced displacements happened, you can begin to see, for example, people in Jaffa tended to migrate down into Gaza, or some on into Egypt. Up the north, they tended to go pushed up to Lebanon, or pushed up into the northern parts, along the northern part of Galilee. And down here on the eastern side, many were moved into Jordan, and some into Syria. And then here in the middle, you can see Palestinians. Some went into the Palestinian areas of Ramallah and Jerusalem, and there's Nablus. So overall, what was the outcome of all of that? I've tried to show you in the yellow circle the territorial gains that were achieved by, particularly here in the north, as the area around Acna and Safad were taken over by the Zionists. That the land bridge between Gaza and West Bank was broken by taking over a lot of the villages here. And then down south in the Negev, the big area that had been assigned to Gaza was taken back, or taken over control. So Asad will probably be able to tell us about his experience here around Ashkenaz and being moved into Gaza. Okay, so a lot of the story of Nakba was hidden and not worked through, but it was Professor Ilan Pape, who grew up in Haifa. He did this amazing piece of work in pulling the whole story together, and published an amazing book in 2006 called The Ethnic Cleansing. That concept of ethnic cleansing wasn't around at that time in the late 1940s. And so the concept of ethnic cleansing comes from what happened in the 1990s as Yugoslavia broke up. And here I'm trying to pull together three elements of what is involved in ethnic cleansing. That first of all, it's a forced expulsion of local people, indigenous people, and their families from their homes in a particular region or area. And as a result, of course, that creates a huge refugee problem where that's why the key becomes a symbolic thing for Palestinians, because they took the key of the houses hoping that they could come back, but the right of return has never been acknowledged. The second element of ethnic cleansing is that as the local population are forced out, then it is repopulated by a new ethnic group of people who take over the houses and the land and the farms and so on, and become the basis for a new nation state, a more homogeneous nation state or a pure nation state. And the third element of ethnic cleansing is that it's not just something that is suddenly happens, but it is achieved through advanced planning. And I've tried to show you how that happened through Ben Gurion's planning. And it was executed, ethnic cleansing is executed in a systematic way. So we end there saying that ethnic cleansing now constitutes a crime against humanity. We in Ireland, or we in Kairos, why we see this as important to remember Nakba is that we believe that in order to create a just and lasting peace, we must acknowledge and we must address what happened during the Nakba year, and that and the suffering of Palestinian people during that need to be acknowledged in the public, in the international world order. So secondly, we hope it will still be possible for Palestinians and Israelis to acknowledge these past deeds that were both oppressive and hurtful of each other's community over the past 50 years. That's a huge undertaking, and it's hope, we keep that hope alive that it is possible, but many days it's dashed by, again, no recognition of what has happened. And so thirdly, we all must work harder to achieve a new political set of relationships between Palestinians and Israelis. For many years, that has been worked on politically at the international level by creating two states, that there would be a Palestinian state alongside, side by side, with a Jewish state. But the more ground that is taken by the Israeli forces, there may be the less political likelihood that that's going to happen. And so we still hope, and so that's why in recent years, the proposal for a one-state solution is emerging. But that one state, in order to be effective for Palestinians, it must have full civil rights and equal economic entitlements. So there's a lot of political work to be done. And today in Israel, there are many people who feel that a second Nakba is already underway or has been underway for some time. And we certainly want to express our solidarity with Palestinians as they continue to suffer. Okay, back to you.
Right. We now go to Asad Abu Sharkh, who lives in Dublin, but whose family were expelled from Majd al-Ashkelon in the coastal part of southern Palestine in 1948. Asad is going to share with us some of his family's experience. Over to you, Asad.
Thank you very much for giving me this chance to talk about Nakba, which is actually ethnic cleansing, as has been named by Ilan Babey. Before I start to talk about the Nakba, I must give some background. You know that the Zionist movement, and the first, Herzl, he wrote a book, Der Judenstaat, and in his diaries he said, I quote, "We will establish in Palestine a state for Jews, all Jews and only Jews. And then as far as the Arabs who live there, those who live in Palestine will be employed to cleanse the land of its reptiles, or to use them as water drawers and wood hewers." End of quote. This is Herzl. This is what he said. That is to say, there is a pretense malice, a premeditated crime. From the very first day of Zionism, they were doing their best to come to Palestine, to occupy and to ethnically cleanse. If we move from Herzl, a panoramic image to Ben Gurion, when Ben Gurion, you see, in Palestine, he said, there is nothing immoral. There is nothing immoral in transferring the Palestinian people. And this is why Ben Gurion and the Zionist movement formed two committees, one called the Transfer Committee or Deportation Committee, and the other one for naming, that is to say, to Hebraize the names and then to deport the whole people. And Ben Gurion and the Zionist movement at that time, they draw out the plans to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. Before Plan Dalit, there were Plan A, B, or C, which they started before Plan Dalit. Plan Dalit was on the 10th of March, 1948. Before it, there was the other plans in 1947. And this is why, for example, the neighborhood of Jerusalem, Lifta, was ethnically cleansed in January 1948, before the Plan Dalit, and the lucid plan before Plan Dalit calls for killing the Palestinian political leadership, damaging their coffee houses, their clubs, killing anybody who is opposing them, killing anybody who is instigating, poisoning the water wells, so on and so forth. Plan Dalit, as it was reported by Ilan Babey, and in the words of Plan Dalit, I will read them exactly as documented in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing, before I move. These operations, the operations they were planned in order to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people, these operations can be carried out in the following manner: either by destroying villages, by setting fire to them, by blowing them up, and by planting mines in their debris, and especially of those population centers which are difficult to control continuously, or by mounting combing and control operations according to the following guidelines: encirclement of the villages, conducting a search inside them. In case of resistance, the armed forces must be wiped out and the population expelled outside the borders of the state. These are the words used in the order. And another, for example, Israeli historian, one of those historiographers, used the following words in the ethnic cleansing. He said, we stole the land, we expelled the people, we uprooted the trees, we depopulated the villages, we renamed the villages, we massacred the population, we tortured them, their men, and raped their women. We tortured their men, raped their women, beat and tortured children, occupied and annexed, conquered the land, bombed their cities, demolished their homes, flattened their refugee camps. And this is why this settler colonial state, Israel, it is called settler colonial state. Settler colonialism is different from traditional colonialism. In settler colonialism, it is based on two logic. Logic number one, dehumanization and degradation. Logic number two, elimination and annihilation. And that entails, in the words of the Israeli neo-historians, number one, genocide, to commit genocide against the people. Number two, ethnocide, to kill those who are not Jews, the other ethnic groups. Number three, sociocide, to destroy the Palestinian society. Number four, politicide, to kill any political structures for the Palestinians. Number five, herbicide, to destroy their towns and cities. And number six, to destroy memoricide, to deface and to efface the memory of the Palestinians on their country. This is why they changed the names of everything, they Hebraized the names, and they transferred the people. Now, they started that, according to Plan Dalit, they started with from Haifa, then Jaffa, Bisan, Safad, so on, and Jerusalem, that they finished the coastline almost on other villages in March, because the plan was on the 10th of March, April, May. And then after that, after finishing everything there, then they moved to the south, to the Negev area, and then to Ashkelon. Now, unfortunately, the mandated power, Britain, which was supposed to protect the Palestinians, because the mandate was category A. Category A means that the mandatory power should lead the people to their independence, protect them until they take their independence. And unfortunately, they didn't do that. They left us and they decided to leave without protecting the Palestinians, but they collaborated, not only that, but they collaborated as the Zionist gangs were committing massacres against the Palestinian people. They collaborated with them. For example, they withdrew from Jaffa, left Jaffa to the Zionist gangs, left Haifa, left so on and so forth. And this is why, for example, the most British historian, Toynbee, said, as an Englishman, I can't but indict my country for the crime committed against the Palestinian people. And this is the only personal reparation I can make. End of quote. The British collaborated for their own interests, of course, with the Zionists in order to establish this apartheid state. Now, now the Palestinians, of course, in the southern area of Palestine, and after the massacre of Deir Yassin and the massacre of Duema, you know, the massacre, for example, in Duema, where 400 people were killed, the Jewish soldier who took part in the massacre, according to Jewish historians, according to eyewitnesses, the Jewish soldiers who took part in the massacre reported horrific scenes. What are they? Babies whose skulls were cracked down, women raped or buried alive in houses, men stabbed to death. Soldiers started to shoot indiscriminately. People sought shelter in the mosque, but they were massacred. And then there was another massacre in Lud and Ramla, you know, and I remind you of that before I move to Ashkelon, where the leader was Rabin and Igal alone. Rabin, when they asked, because these were part of the Palestinian state, and Ashkelon was part of the Palestinian state. When they asked Ben Gurion, what should we do with Lidda and Ramla? Ben Gurion waved his hand, giving the impression that you should drive them out, which they did, and they committed a massacre. The people of Lid, they sought shelter in the mosque. It is called Masjid Dahmash, but they were killed and they were slaughtered in cold blood in Dahmash and in the streets of Lid, and then they did the same in Ramla. Now, there was second truce, and then after that, of course, the Egyptians, there were some Egyptians, they would withdraw, they moved to Ashkelon. Now, Ashkelon at that time, it is a town in the southern part of Palestine, famous for its citrus groves in Palestine. It was vibrant, flourishing city. Now it is very infamous for its Ashkelon prison. Ashkelon prison, where many people died in that, or they have long life or life imprisonment by the Israelis. But before, it was famous for its citrus groves. Now the Israelis decided to move, and at that time Israel had an air force. So they bombarded the south using their air force, which they got from Eastern Europe at that time, from Czechoslovakia and other countries. And then they started hitting, and they started raids on people, killing many people, and then terrorizing people. And then there were, of course, some of the planes were dropping leaflets to tell them either you die or you commit suicide or you have to leave Ashkelon. Some of the Ashkelons, of course, and my family was one of them, some of the Ashkelons, because they were terrorized and by the Israelis and by, of course, the town was encircled by Haganah, by Ergun, or by Malmach. Malmach was very atrocious and violent group. They shoot to kill. So some of the people decided to leave Ashkelon. Almost quarter of the Ashkelonis, of the Majdan people, stayed in Majdan, and 3/4 were forced out. Now, as they were forced out, of course, the only thing they took with them, they had no time, because they were threatened, and they were airplanes dropping explosive barrels. They were dropping explosive barrels at that time. And there were many casualties, many houses destroyed. So the people have to flee hurriedly and in haste. And the only thing they took with them is their keys. Some of them, they left even their food or cooking on the stove. They couldn't take it with them. They couldn't take their belongings. They left even their belongings, their jewelry, their everything, and they moved. Now, as they went, they left, they fled. Of course, there were not enough transport, means of transport at that time. So the people have to use either camels, donkeys, whatever means, available horses, or some old trucks, and they have to walk it from Ashkelon to Gaza. It's about 20. To Gaza, it is about 25 kilometers. It is about 25 kilometers. Some of them, of course, died of thirst, of hunger, and some of them even couldn't. My grandmother, I'm talking about my grandmother. My grandmother left my uncle. She dropped him because she couldn't continue carrying him and fleeing, as she, they were receiving. They were at the receiving end of Israeli bullets and sniping bullets and planes and so on and so forth. Some of them left their sons, and then they walked and with nothing, and we left our orange field, which is around 1,000 dulum, and our house and everything. And the people moved to Gaza and lived in shanties and shacks, nothing. And then in camps, the life was very bad. They were dreaming of returning one day, because there were Israel in 1948, there were two conditions for accepting Israel in the United Nations. Number one, Resolution 184, which called for the partition of Palestine into two states. And number two, which calls for the right, 194, which calls for the right of return and compensation for the Palestinian refugees. These are two conditions that the United States put as precondition for the admission of Israel, of the state of Israel, in the United Nations. But unfortunately, Israel is being protected by the Americans and by the Europeans, and the Palestinians have been dreaming ever since 1948 to return. After that, Israel continued its, after that continued its war against Gaza Strip and against the Palestinians. I personally survived around 4 or 6 devastating wars miraculously, in these refugee camps. The refugee camps, that it is shanties. There were no clean water in the refugee camp inside the house. There were no toilets. You have to go out in the street for a toilet, and you have to go out somewhere for taps in the street in order to collect water. And we lived our life in this, and this is in life. This is how you can describe the life of the refugee camps, of the Palestinian refugee camp. We are still dreaming. We are not against the Jews as such. We are ready to live in one state, one democratic state with equal rights, with justice and peace, with our rights of self-determination, and our right of return, and to live in harmony, Muslims, Jews, Christians together, because this is how we can build a flourishing country, and this is how we can live as human beings, good human beings, kind-hearted human beings. Otherwise, I can tell you, with a government like that of Netanyahu and all the governments, because he is now, these are the the inheritors of herds and the Orion, and the heirs of them, and they are quite determined on the annihilation of the Palestinian people. They are bent on the destruction of the Palestinian people, but we are calling for peace, for justice, to live together in one state. And unfortunately, the Europeans, and especially the Americans, give them more weapons, the most sophisticated weapons, in order to commit more crimes for their own interests. And this is why there can never, ever be peace. Never, ever be peace in that part of the world unless the Palestinian people regain their rights and to have peace with justice. Not Pax Israelita, not Pax Americana, not Pax Romana, peace with justice, and which will reinstate the Palestinian, which will grant us our right to self-determination and our right of return. And I thank you very much. I hope that Kairos helps in that, and Kairos is doing a fabulous job for the Palestinian people. I cannot thank you enough on behalf of the Palestinian people for your work, and I hope to live together and to see you in one democratic Palestine, and to be our neighbors, our guests, our good friends in Palestine. Thank you very much.
Asad, thank you for sharing that terrible experience of attack, destruction, dispossession, of being driven as refugees into Gaza. Unfortunately, the process is still continuing, and in the occupied Palestinian territories, dispossession is still taking place. And we're going to go now and to hear from Finn Stoneman, who last winter was a human rights monitor with the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Accompaniment Program. And Finn is going to share with us what is happening now in the South Hebron Hills. Finn, over to you.
Thank you, John. Hello, my name is Finn Stoneman. I'm from Galway in the west of Ireland, and I was a human rights monitor in the West Bank from November last year until February this year in the South Hebron Hills. EAPPI, the Ecumenical Accompanying Program in Palestine and Israel, is a human rights program that has been operating in the West Bank for 20 years under the World Council of Churches and is led by Quakers Britain in the UK and Ireland. I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes about the ongoing process of the Nakba in the displacement and dispossession of Palestinians in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. In the words of the Lebanese Palestinian author Elias Khoury, the Nakba is a past that hasn't truly passed. In terms of the immediate need and urgency for this, in 2022, last year, was the deadliest year to be a Palestinian, with over since 2005, 167 people were killed by the Israeli military, 31 of them being children. And so far, this year, since the 4th of April, 95 Palestinians have died, and 14 Israelis and 1 foreign national have died due to this occupation and conflict. So it is inherently harmful for Israeli society as well. Before beginning, I'd just like to recognize 2 points of that. My privilege as an international to enter and travel around the West Bank, which many Palestinians, both within the West Bank or within Israel, where they are 1/5 of the population, and Palestinians living outside in the diaspora outside of Palestine don't have that ease and ability. And also to recognize that the Nakba is not just a history, that it is a deeply personal and family history for many Palestinians, as Asad and Shadia are bravely sharing, and that this is also the Nakba is largely a hidden history or an unpopular history in global terms. Am I on to the next slide? Sorry. Okay. Is that the slide of 2 maps? Yeah, thanks. Okay, so on the left map, you can see an image of the Palestine and Israel and the West Bank. I was for 3 months in the South Hebron Hills, where the green star is. And on the right, you see a close-up of Masafariata, which is a collection of 13 communities. And it's about approximately 1,150 people, 569 of whom are children. Masafariata is about 36 kilometers squared, which is about the size of a little bit bigger than the Burren National Park or the size of Kilkenny town. Also, in the right map is the blue area, which since the 1980s, the Israeli state has termed and designated as Firing Zone 918. A firing zone is an area which becomes Israeli state land and is used exclusively for military training, live military training, and doesn't allow any Palestinians to live there. Since the Palestinian communities living in Masafariata face forced displacement, forcible transfer from this area. Although, as you'll see, both the red settlements of Maun, Mitzpe Yair, and Abigail and Metzadot Yehuda also infringe within Firing Zone 918, but they have not been so far told that they would have to evacuate their accommodation for this. You'll also see at the bottom of the map the green dotted line, which is the 1967 borders, and then the black dotted separation barrier, which largely deviates from the original 1967 borders, and 2004 was recognized by the International Criminal Court as illegal and to be put down. So in this image is 7 children looking towards their new school in the village of Asfaya al-Fawqa in Masafariata. It was a new school with 22 students enrolled, and it's a mixed school of boys and girls for the ages 5 to 12. It had 2 rooms and a staff room, and that's very similar to many schools, country schools around beside me in the west of Ireland. This photo was taken by my teammate Kim, because on Thursday the 17th of November, a demolition order was ordered to this school, which gave it 96 hours to file a legal defense. In Palestine, the Friday and Saturday are the weekend. So when a demolition order is ordered on a Thursday, that takes out 2 working days. So 4 days, working days quickly becomes 2 in terms of trying to supply a defense. And the quote by Fatima is, "The school is very important to us, otherwise the children have to walk 6 kilometers to get to school." On Wednesday, the 23rd of November, the school was demolished. At 10 a.m., our driver and translator received a call that a bulldozer and excavator had been seen entering the South Hebron Hills. We arrived to chaotic scenes of the Israeli border police pushing back a crowd generally led by women and children to create a perimeter around the building. We were told that before this, local Palestinians in the community, Palestinian activists who came from nearby communities to show solidarity, and Israeli peace activists had remained within the classrooms and tried to teach a class in an effort to prevent this demolition from happening, but that sound bombs were used, and the Israeli border police violently and traumatically removed all those people from these rooms. When the demolition began to take place, the crowd fell silent out of shock. It took 20 minutes for the new school to be demolished. But in the Palestinian resilience, once the army and border police had left, the local people there gathered what items they could and began to rebuild the school. We spoke to Yasser Mohammed, the Director of Education in Yatta, and he told us the aim of occupation is to prevent education. This is a crime. The proof is here today after this action. We'll immediately build a tent. No students should be like this. And you can see in his hand, he's holding one of the sound bombs used. This was the new tent in the rubble in the same area where the school was demolished. We visited it on Saturday, the 26th of November. As you can see, this is the inside. Here is the school, the water tanker and a toilet. And on the front of the toilet was the EU European Union humanitarian aid, including Irish aid. On the 1st of December, this tent was confiscated by the Israeli military, and we visited Isfail Folk on the 6th of December, and I took these photos of 2 smaller tents, which replaced that. The Israeli military government's response to this was they demolished a building built illegally in an area designated as a firing zone. Unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident to education in the West Bank, nor indeed in Masafir Yatta. It's part of a military occupation that affects all aspects of Palestinian life and does not just affect children. One woman, an Arabic teacher Arabic and English teacher in Hebron, told me that occupation has affected every decision she has ever made in her life. And I believe that demonstrates the overwhelming burden that occupation presents. There are currently 57 schools in the West Bank under threat of demolition, affecting approximately 5,300 students. And this act was illegal under the United Nations Charter for the Rights of Child, as well as the 4th Geneva Convention. In Masafir Yatta, we witnessed the ongoing pressure and human rights violations placed on the population. From the 4th of May last year, the Israeli High Court ruled that there's no legal barriers for the planned expulsion of Palestinian residents in Masafir Yatta to make way for military training, firing zone 918. And while this is deemed legal in the Israeli state, it would constitute a war crime under international law, the forcible transfer of these people. And on the 2nd of January this year, the residents were told by the District Coordination Office, which is the Israeli military people in charge of controlling civil and military matters in the West Bank, to prepare themselves in a short time. We witnessed many human rights violations occurring in Masafir Yatta during my 3 months there. This is, unfortunately, this is a very current and real threat. Through following the news, since I've returned, I saw that the school in Jibal Dib, another village in Masafir Yatta, was demolished very recently, Sunday, the 7th of May. However, on this case, it was a similar primary school for 40 children aged 6 to 10, but the Israeli military arrived at 5 a.m. They showed no documentation. They took a journalist's camera by force. And although this is incredibly upsetting, I think it shows that the importance of international pressure on this issue, and that the soldiers may even be aware of what they're doing is illegal and wrong, and that this is the role for international advocacy in recognizing this and standing with Palestinians in Masafir Yatta. You can take action by signing a template letter to a TD, MEP or MP on Eyewitness blogs, or signing a related petition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Finn, for showing us that picture of destruction of a school. We're now going to move on to Sophie Gregg, who also served as a human rights monitor in the occupied West Bank this past winter. Sophie was based in Hebron, and I understand Sophie is going to talk about another aspect of difficulty for Palestinian people, and that is the violent behavior of the illegal settlers who wish to take over land from Palestinian people. So, Sophie, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for having me present to you. I'm just going to share the screen with you now. Okay, so I'll first introduce you to a farmer from Hebron city center. This is Abdul Karim Al-Jabari, and he's sitting here in his living room. He's a farmer and his main crop is olive trees, but he's also an accidental shepherd. The reason he's an accidental shepherd is that he once bought about half a dozen sheep for an event and he wanted to use them for meat, but he actually enjoyed having sheep so much that he decided to just keep them as pets. We asked him if he had a catchphrase that he wanted us to share with the world. And he said, "A day without laughter is a wasted day," like Charlie Chaplin says. So he's a farmer and his main crop is olive trees. But every time he goes to harvest or even just staying in his house in general, he has difficulty with settlers. You can see in this image here that he's covered in bandages. And the reason he's covered in bandages is because when he went out into his land last June, he was attacked by a group of young settlers that hit him with a metal bar so badly that they thought that they'd killed him. And the reason that he knew that they thought they had killed him was because they uploaded a video of themselves to social media shouting, "Abdul Karim is dead, Abdul Karim is dead." But he didn't die, and he's here in his living room recovering, and he made a full recovery and went back to being a farmer. We spoke with him in June, and we spoke with his daughter Ayat as well, who expressed that they were worried about an impending second Nakba because settlers wanted their land so badly. They wanted their land because it was in a small triangle between two Israeli settlements in Hebron, and the settlers wanted to connect them. This is their stated aim, and they've been quite open about that. So talking about it, his daughter Ayat said that they also live like prisoners, to the extent that whenever she leaves the house, her family worry about her. And if they see on the news that a woman has been shot anywhere in the West Bank, they panic and find out if it's her. So when we first had this conversation, we weren't sure exactly how common that sort of thing was occurring, a family where this had happened. So this is the family of Gufran Warasna, who live just up the road in a refugee camp. And they've already experienced the Nakba in 1948. They lost their land in what is now Israel and ended up as refugees in the West Bank. So having lost their land already, they're now also in imminent danger of losing their lives. And this is what happened to Gufran. She was a 31-year-old journalist on her way to work when she was shot by an Israeli soldier. You can see in the image here that this is her family, and they were making, this photo was taken last year, they were making star-shaped biscuits filled with dates for Eid, which is like a Muslim version of Christmas. And it was their first time doing it without her because she had been shot a number of weeks before by the Israeli army. The army said that Gufran had a knife, but eyewitnesses disputed that. And they were not very hopeful that any investigation would be fruitful or would result in justice for their daughter at all. Her father said, "I love my daughter like I love my mother, and I cannot erase her picture from my mind." We asked them if they had approached the Israeli authorities to investigate her death, and they said their investigations are insulting. Making up a stupid reason why they murdered your daughter is worse than her murder. Did you see what happened to Shireen Abu Akleh? She was an American citizen and a beloved national figure. What hope does my daughter have if she can't get justice? So this Shireen Abu Akleh was another figure that was mentioned to us constantly in the West Bank. This is a mural that was being painted in June 2022. And many people expressed to us that they felt that because such an important figure and such a journalist was not able to get justice for her killing, that any other Palestinian would not be able to do so. I'll give you an example here. This is a statement from Riyad Mansour, the Palestinian ambassador to the UN. And I'll just read it out for you. He said, Shireen's killing is the story, the same story she was telling. The difference is that this time the world knew the victim. We're not killed because of what we do, but because of who we are. There is no immunity for a journalist, a president, a health worker, a UN staff, a farmer, a child, a baby, a pregnant mother, an elderly, a professor, a dual citizen, a minister, an officer, a judge. If you are a Palestinian, you are a legitimate target. Israel can decide if you get to live or die. You rightly called for accountability, but Israel has enjoyed impunity for so long, it does not know what the hell you're talking about. This is the finished mural that was completed a couple of days later. Everywhere in Palestine that we went to report on all sorts of human rights abuses, mostly to do with violence towards people in order to take their land or violence towards people who had already lost their land. People talked about Shireen Abu Akleh and that she was a symbol of hope, and that in assassinating her, a lot of their hope had been assassinated. They unanimously asked us in almost every village and every incident that we went to take any action at all on an international level to end this Israeli impunity, because they felt that Israel had interpreted this killing as a green light to inflict anything at all, including a second Nakba. One of the things we could do about this is we could support a bill that's being taken before the Dáil by John Brady and contact our TDs to ask them to support this bill, which would have Ireland divesting from companies that profit from this Israeli occupation of the West Bank. And that is one of the things that could end impunity for Israel, and one of the things that could prevent the ongoing and worsening Nakba. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, and I'll just leave it there.
Sophie, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for telling that two terrible stories, really. An attack on a shepherd and the shooting of a young, beautiful journalist, Gofran. We're now going to move to Canada, actually. Shadia is a Palestinian, but she has just completed MA studies in Vancouver School of Theology, and her thesis compares the colonial structures that have been used in Palestine and that were used against the indigenous people of North America. So, Shadia, I look forward to hearing your analysis. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Just a lot has been said. It's a lot to process, but I kind of just want to affirm that solidarity really has no boundaries, and we're in different geographical locations, but our minds and our passion is towards seeing a peaceful resolution to the colonization in Palestine. And for me, one of the aftermaths of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that at the start of each meeting, we do a land acknowledgement to express the recognition that who has been living in these lands before it became a nation state. And so as a Palestinian right now commemorating the Nakba, I particularly want to highlight that land acknowledgement here is also an affirmation that the land was and is not empty upon the discovery incursions of the European tradesmen and settlers. So I also acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations right now. See, one of the reasons I enrolled in this program, I think, is to explore how Indigenous peoples in North America in general, like what Finn called maybe this hidden history of Canada and US, especially those who, looking at those who adhere to the Christian faith among the Indigenous peoples and how they navigate their experiences of othering, right? On the one hand, they were othered as uncivilized or savages, but also biblical Canaanites. But on the other hand, they're God's children, and they're a community of creation in a sacred covenant with God. And so one of the outcomes of my learning process is to converse as a Palestinian Christian with North American Indigenous understandings of land and theological discourses. So I'm just going to present some anecdotes of my research that are taking place specifically in academia, and tailoring them maybe to put into perspective how this applies to our moment in commemorating 75 years of Palestinian Nakba. Of course, the bulk of the writings is about a similar yet different experience of settler colonialism. Primarily articles written either by indigenous or Palestinian or both. They're informed by co-resistant activism on the ground. And so, for example, they identify two similarities between, in this case, Canadian or American settler colonial projects and Israel. They both involve the displacement of indigenous people from their land and the theft of that land and its resources for the use and benefit of the settler population. And on the shared experiences of dispossession, they draw parallels between the establishment of the Canadian reserve system and the ongoing Nakba of the Palestinians, which we know started maybe in 48, intensified in 67, along with the creation of the apartheid wall almost 20 years ago. On the theft of land, both settler colonial projects used force and laws, such as the Indian Act and the cultural genocide in Canada. But they also, both projects use the tool of controlling the movement of indigenous peoples. Right? Canada used something called the pass system, which is very similar to the Palestinian reality of extensive systems of permits, checkpoints, restricting and regulating the movement of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. And let's not forget the siege of Gaza since 2006. Another example is a Dakota scholar, her name is Wazia Tawan. She wrote an article after she visited the occupied Palestinian territories almost 10 years ago, along with a group of women of color. One of them is the famous Angela Davis. And she describes the Israeli occupation as a high-speed, high-tech version of the colonization of American Indian homelands. She compares Zionist ideology to manifest destiny, noting Israeli and US colonization are based on a belief in a divinely sanctioned right to occupy someone else's land. On colonial ideology manifesting in judicial and legislative laws, Wazia Tawan compared the experience of the Dakota people to the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. In both places, the respective governments used legal tactics to physically erase indigenous people from their lands. In addition, she compares a tactic of erasure that Asad, I think, mentioned a few examples, through renaming landscapes and denying indigenous place names to impose a colonial identity on the land. All such efforts, she explains, are designed to assert a claim to land, while simultaneously attempting to make the indigenous the foreigner. It's important to note that some scholars are very cautious of using a comparative approach because it collapses the histories in these contexts. I mean, just to take a simple example, is the role of military rule and governance is different in both contexts. In Canada, the dominant instrument used in indigenous elimination for territorial expansion has been biological and cultural warfare, rather than military occupation, which we know too well is the predominant Israeli instrument towards the Palestinians. In addition, a settler colonial paradigm is flawed because it doesn't recognize the dual positionality of Palestinians who live in the diaspora, many of them in their own colonial context, right? They've been displaced as a result of Israeli colonization, but are also in place of stolen lands in a different context, Canada or the US, for example. So the lack of attention of this dual positionality impacts how we do co-solidarity. Fostering a global solidarity with Palestinian people while addressing indigenous struggles for sovereignty and self-determination in Canada, for example, can't be separated from capitalist and imperial structure because race, class, and gender relations are all intertwined with each other. Disregarding them weakens their role in solidarity work. And throughout these rich conversations, I saw that the large role that Palestinians and North American indigenous peoples play are as colonized, while the majority of the writing focuses on the colonizer. This begs the question of our agency in academic discourse, beyond being casualties or subjects of colonization. And a similar dynamic was also apparent in the theological conversation. To start with, there were very few conversations that are taking place. But the main discourse there is also about the colonizer, particularly the role of conquest in biblical narrative that was used to justify the annihilation of indigenous peoples for the benefit of settlers. They interpret themselves and place themselves as God's chosen people in their promised land. Just to give you two examples, Steve Salaita, who is a Palestinian American literary scholar in Native Studies, he wrote the book called The Holy Land in Transit. And he attributes the American conquest of the New World to a biblical understanding or interpretation of the conquest of Joshua. Then he shows how the same biblical understanding of conquest has been transferred from the New World back to the Holy Land. In a similar way, Robert Smith looks at the writings of American Christian pilgrims, who, especially during the second half of the 19th century, towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, is rule in Palestine, which was partly impacted by the development of the steamship, which increased pilgrimage trips. And he shows that this geographical imagination of settler colonialism, and from different sectors of writing, it depends on the extension of a white settler colonial gaze. He shows that the American self-understanding of settler colonial logic, expressed in Manifest Destiny, has transferred to Palestine. And he elaborates how such colonial gaze, for example, proclaimed Palestinian land as terra nullius, even and especially when indigenous peoples are in plain sight. The seminal work of Robert Allen Warrior, who's a miscegenation, Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indian, which is usually paralleled with Naim Atiq's Justice and Only Justice, in how they both critique liberation theology's interpretation of the Exodus story, right? Can't be God the creator, also embracing comfort. So the question, how things presented these conflicts and their who are adherent of the faith, this edged side of interpreting them. Well, I think to start with, they name and identify ways academia in general and the School of Theology in particular were and continue to be colonial sites. For example, while Western theory claims that objectivity can be achieved, primarily non-Western scholars collapse this binary because their lived experiences are at the forefront of their writing, of their interpretation. So the creation, largely attributed to Edward Said, for example, decolonization, that has also transferred to theological discourse, is a means to decenter Western dominant theologies, but at the same time, creating space for an indigenized theology. For example, Mitri Rahib's Palestinian theology, he doesn't separate the Bible from its geopolitical context. He says the Holy Land doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it is not a replica of a Western screenshot of an overly spiritualized biblical gaze. And I think today, while we commemorate 70 years of the Nakba, there's a need to expound our solidarity and our conversation with indigenous peoples to foster kind of a global solidarity. There's ample of evidence, for example, that shows, right, the Canadian and Israeli governments employed similar processes, tactics, and structures to dispossess and displace their indigenous peoples. But then why is there still a discomfort in acknowledging and naming Israeli settler colonialism? Why does it feel like we are still being withheld from naming things for what they are? Is 75 years not enough? I think I'll end with a quote of the Lakota scholar, Wazia Tawan, that she has brought in after visiting the occupied Palestinian territories. She was very inspired by Palestinian resistance. And she distinguishes between the aspirations expressed in the resistance of Palestinians and her own Lakota people. And she says, Given the similar processes of invasion, occupation, and colonization, what is striking is not that our peoples have similarly suffered, but that in the 21st century, our responses to that suffering are so vastly different. Thank you.
Shadia, thank you very much for that. We did lose a little bit of what you were saying because the sound went, but that was unfortunate. But thank you. You gave us a very thoughtful understanding of some distortions of theology, like the idea of a chosen people, of the land being wholly for one group, and that the indigenous people can be removed in order to allow the chosen people to take over. I'll be asking you where to find the book, The Holy Land in Transit. I'd like to read that. But we're going to go now to a short period of reflection and prayer, which Tim is going to lead. Tim was looked after a church congregation in Sheikh Jarrah for 3 years, from 2010 to 2013. And currently he looks after humanitarian programs in Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia for the Church of the Nazarene. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone else who shared. I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm conscious of time. I would like to read a passage of scripture from Matthew chapter 5, Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, which is a very powerful passage of scripture that has a lot to teach us about peace and God's intention for the world. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." I want to read a prayer that was written by Reverend Sally Azar. She's a Lutheran minister, Palestinian minister, and I've adapted the prayer slightly, but I would like to finish with this prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We lift our prayers to you, our Lord, for the whole world. You see and hear of the hardships that humans suffer from their neighbor. We ask you, Lord, to look at every sufferer with mercy and love. On this day, we pray for the Palestinian people, Christians and Muslims. We are still searching for stability and peace, for justice and freedom. The human looks at himself more than looking at the other. O Lord, you always look at us as equals. You do not differentiate between rich and poor, between nationalities or people. Grant us, O Lord, to look into the future with hope. Grant us not to look at our painful past, but rather to look forward for a bright future that you have prepared for us. Be with men and women, with the young men and women, with the young and old, to find purpose and hope in their lives. O Lord, hear our prayers. In the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you to everyone for this act of remembrance as we remember the Nakba that happened 75 years ago, but which, as we have seen, is still happening today. We have heard of the complicity of American politicians and of European politicians in giving impunity to Israel to carry on with that program. That's something that we should struggle to overcome and to protest against. I just want to leave you with three possible actions that you might like to undertake. If you are not already part of our Kairos Ireland mailing list, I'm going to put up an email address that you can use in order to say that you would like to be on our mailing list. So that's one thing. The second thing, we heard from Finn and from Sophie about eyewitness stories of things they saw happening in the South Hebron Hills and in Hebron today. If you go to the eyewitnessblogs.com, there are regular accounts by human rights monitors who are part of the World Council of Churches program there. I want to draw your attention to the stop trade with the settlements and also the signing of the Irish anti-apartheid campaign pledge. And this is a pledge encouraging people to lobby politicians in Ireland so that Ireland could enact the Occupied Territories Bill and could take a lead in Europe in raising awareness of the issues of justice and peace, which alone can provide for a prosperous and settled future for Israel and Palestine. We've heard the case for one state in which there will be equal rights for everyone. And that is a consistent theme that is announced by people who have suffered and are suffering the effects of the settler colonial occupation of Palestine. Anyway, thanks to everybody, and we leave you with that. And thanks especially to Jeffrey Corrie, to Asad Abu Sharkh, to Finn Stoneman, to Sophie Gregg, to Shadia Qubti, and to Tim Bowen-Evans. So thank you very much. And please do keep in touch with us, and we'll try to share with you what we are trying to do in order to find justice and peace in the Holy Land. Thank you.